Welcome to ODR Cyberweek 2022. It's my pleasure to invite everyone to this 5-day free online event series that has been happening for the last 21 years. We have our speaker today to thank for all of this. Ethan Katsh is the innovator and visionary who came up with the idea and the concept of online dispute resolution in the 1990s and founded the center that is hosting this series. He is as I said, the visionary. He's also a prolific author prior to developing online dispute resolution, but also in the field of dispute resolution. He has been the director prior to me of the center and has been the first experimenter in the use of technology with handling disputes, creating online ombuds and e-commerce dispute resolution practices, and continuing to be a visionary about what is around the corner. Can't wait to hear him talk about one area of his many areas of expertise about ODR and healthcare. But before we get to that, I just want to give you a little overview of what's happening this week. We've got panels every day that specifically focus on ODR beyond monetary disputes. Later in the week, we'll look at immigration cases, at digital privacy, at arbitration of labor grievances, and of multi-party dispute resolution post-COVID. There's also a negotiation simulation happening this week, language tracks in Spanish and Portuguese, and tech demos. There's a lot to see and participate in. So thank you to the many who are presenting and those colleagues who are joining us. Can I also make a plug that you join us in a number of hours from now? Take a look at the program. On the East Coast, it's at 7:30 in the United States, but that's some other time elsewhere in the world. For a social hour, it's a chance to meet friends, new and old, and we're also doing it at the end of the week on Friday. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Ethan and thank everyone for being here.
Well, thank you, Leah. I think in addition to Leah's other skills, she gives very nice introductions. So thank you again. Thank you, Noam, for helping to organize this session. If there are no problems with it, I credit you for that. Thanks, Dan, and for your talk, and thanks, Colin, for everything over the years. I think this is an important session because it's part of the theme, the track we have of ODR going beyond monetary disputes. And as you know, ODR, it's one of its foundations in e-commerce disputes and has continued to focus on commercial disputes. I should say we were very lucky to do an experiment with eBay. eBay disputes were easy. There were monetary disputes, but small amounts of money. Basically, what was going on there was that parties were angry with each other, and if they talked a little bit, they'd stop being angry, and that was the end of it. I think it's taken a while, but we're now moving way beyond that. And these disputes that are listed on the screen are difficult ones. They're chosen because they're important, because there are a lot of them. Actually, I should say that, I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. I should say that the whole issue of ODR has come to the fore because of one simple reason, and that is there are growing numbers of disputes. I don't think anybody's keeping numerical track of that, but I think it's, to me, it's obvious, and I haven't had anyone argue with me about it. We live in a culture that, in all of its institutions, is dealing with increases in disputes. Some of you know I'm fond of quoting Getting to Yes, where there's a line that says, "Conflict is a growth industry." That was 2 decades ago, and the conflict was a growth industry then. It's a growth industry even more today. Before going on specifically to healthcare, I thought I would amplify my thinking a little bit about why we have all these disputes. Let me see if this works. There's this poor fellow, and this is not the most informative of images, but maybe it will stay with you and maybe you can make more sense of it than I have. But basically, it's designed to suggest the shift, the transformation from analog to digital. And if you think about what was analog and has become digital, ranging over almost every facet of our life and all of our things we deal with every day, you can have a sense of why analog to digital sort of explains why we have disputes. I'm not suggesting that understanding analog to digital is as easy as turning on a light bulb, but there are reasons why everything is not going smoothly. And if you look at all of these qualities, you can see that they you can see why it's likely that they generate lots of disputes. And I would focus particularly on the last one, complexity. If you try to understand what the meaning of complexity or how it works, how complex systems work, I think you can get an idea of why on occasion or frequently systems break down. But the most current application of complexity has to do with supply lines. And there's a supply line almost in everything. There's a supply line we'll talk about in healthcare. But the supply line, if it works well, allows big and large and complex systems to function smoothly. But if one part of that system breaks down, the whole system can't really function very well. In the healthcare field, I look at complexity in terms of what were the experts doing 50 years ago and what are they doing today? And 50 years ago, we had patients, doctors, hospitals, maybe drug companies and some insurance companies, but a lot of these other instances, examples just didn't exist. And what's necessary to overcome complexity is that all of these systems work well together. So disputes in healthcare. This is supposed to be a talk about non-monetary disputes, but I should acknowledge here and one other place that, of course, there are huge numbers of monetary disputes in healthcare, but we have institutions for dealing with them, and it's a little more novel to deal with non-monetary disputes, and long-term, maybe just as important. But if you look at billing disputes, malpractice, cost of drugs, and the role of insurance companies, they are all increasing as well. On the other hand, let's look at 5 or 10 other kinds of disputes. The first 3 here, I confess, also deal with money, but then we'll translate some of this into non-monetary disputes. But I chose the first 3 to list here because they're recent developments, and they're recent developments that I think take note of ODR. So those of you, I apologize for those of you out of the US, but all of these are US centric. Maybe they have some connection to where you are. But the so-called No Surprises Act is an attempt to make more rational the charges, the monetary charges for patients if they use out-of-network systems. I'm not going to define what in and out of network systems are, but if you've gotten sick in the US in a place where you don't live, chances are you're going to have to pay more than someone who does live in that location. Many people think that's not really very fair. And federal government recently set up basically an arbitration system to settle these disputes between in-network charges and out-of-network charges. Also, fairly recently, we were going to impose, I don't think it's been imposed yet, but new negotiation requirements for drug prices, particularly those sold to Medicare patients, elderly patients. And lastly, as an example of a health-related monetary solution, we have insurance payments for digital drug therapies. I can't ask you to raise your hand if you know what a digital drug therapy is, but it took me by surprise in a while to do a little looking up to figure out what a digital drug therapy is. And basically, a digital drug therapy, for something you probably do know, is what Fitbit is. Why is it a drug therapy? Because it makes you feel, it can satisfy what a drug does. I think I've got medical drug therapy is any device that's intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. And these all require Food and Drug Administration approval. Are you, in your own minds, I'd suggest that you try to distinguish between, or see if you can easily distinguish between things that fit in this definition and things that don't fit in this definition. And if you want an example of something that does and doesn't at the same time fit the definition, you have the Apple Watch 4, which has built into it an electrocardiogram to detect presence of atrial fibrillation that, according to the FDA, is intended for the use in diagnosis. So that is a digital drug therapy. But the rest of the functions of the Apple Watch, even if they're health related, do not fit that definition. So if you drop dead, or not drop dead, then the outcome is determined. But if you fall ill, let's say, or have an accident, somebody's got to figure out whether what they're doing to you involves something that's approved by the FDA or not approved by the FDA. And that is an issue that's arising over and over again because many of these wearables, so-called quote unquote wearables, clearly have a role in diagnosing. I've got, I don't think, I've got this ring on my finger that's not a wedding ring. Got that on my other hand. So I've got essentially two wedding rings on, but one of them is like a Fitbit. It diagnoses how well I am sleeping at night, since I have a various kind of sleeping disorder. And it's useful for me to know deep sleep, REM sleep, and so forth. Well, that's a diagnostic of a therapy of some kind. But this is on the market, not as something that needs to be approved. And I think most of the apps that you can download from whatever source. Do something health related, but not in the eyes of the Food and Drug Administration, not sufficiently health related. Anyway, it's an ongoing application problem. Now, one issue that does not involve money, at least not directly. I mean, in some respect, everything involves money, but the direct issue is not a monetary issue. It's an accessibility issue. The Veterans Administration has paid for already a new electronic health record system. We'll talk about electronic health records in a few minutes. But the Veterans Administration, if you think about it for a few minutes, has mostly or to a large extent, an elderly population. This elderly population, or parts of it, have difficulty with vision, and the company that built this system built it in a way that you can't increase the font size of the file you're working on, which, as it turns out, excludes many elderly with vision problems from using this this electronic health record system. So they've gone back to the drawing board on that one. Related to the digital drug therapies are what are called medical devices. So this thing I've got on my finger is not a medical device. How do I know that? Well, I know that because it's not regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. Food and Drug Administration these days is involved in distinguishing things that are and things that aren't. And one of them is things that are a medical device, and things that aren't. So if you have a pacemaker put inside of you, that's clearly a medical device. If you're a diabetic carrying around a insulin meter, that's a medical device. But if you're walking around all day with a Fitbit, that's not a medical device. This is not connected to that, but the question of what is healthy is again a question for the Food and Drug Administration. And I suppose you could ask what is healthcare, but what is healthy is a question that arose in connection with food labeling. And of course, we are all interested in knowing what foods are healthy and what are not. And if you do a Google search, the answer to all of these questions is do a Google search. But if you do a Google search, you'll find out that some things can be labeled healthy and some things can't be labeled healthy. And the distinction is often not a single ingredient, but a combination of ingredients, how much of a particular ingredient, excuse me, and so forth. And almost related to this question of what's a hearing aid. Some of you may be wearing hearing aids, or some of you, if you looked into this a week and a half ago, would have learned that you can get a hearing aid, buy a hearing aid that's not really a hearing aid because it's sold over the counter without a prescription. So hearing aids is defined by the federal government. You had to pay for them for a prescription, and the market was inevitably narrower than the number of people who have hearing issues. So the market was small. The market now is suddenly growing because you can go to Costco or CVS or any pharmacy, and either now or in a few weeks, we'll be able to get hearing assistance. I'm sorry, I had written down, I don't know if yes, I wrote it down, what a non-hearing hearing aid is. and it's called, quote, a personal sound amplification product. So if you happen to run into a personal sound amplification product, that's basically a cheap hearing aid. Not necessarily cheap, actually, but a lower cost hearing aid. These are all, I'm being slightly flippant maybe about some of this, but I shouldn't be. These are serious issues that affect lots of people. But an inherently serious issue comes from decentralized clinical trials. And if you're wondering what a shift from analog to digital means, here's an example of that, because decentralized clinical trials are really virtual digital clinical trials. Clinical trials are necessary in order to get FDA approval for drugs in this country. And it's a very serious process, and it has required in the past what are normally called double-blind trials. And I won't explain that to you, but lengthy, highly supervised, and generally face-to-face clinical trials of medications or drugs. And of course, we're now able to do digitally, virtually, what we could only do before in a face-to-face way. So there's enormous pressure to have the Federal Food and Drug Administration allow clinical trials that are not face-to-face, that basically are not analog, and to get data that, in the worst case, is only correlations rather than causations. But the point of double-blind trials is to be persuaded that you're dealing with a cause and effect rather than a correlation of two separate items. I'll skip over the distribution and cost of vaccines to go to doctors and advertisers. And that's an interesting question, because advertisements in newspapers or magazines are basically just advertisements with suggestions and other kinds of information. So in this country, we see them on television routinely. And the last line is usually, go ask your doctor about this. But increasingly, again, in an analog to digital world, the advertisements occurs virtually online. And the end of the advertisement is not go talk to your doctor, but talk to your doctor by pressing a button. So let me just read this. Online advertisements run by pharmaceutical companies now offer a way for people scrolling their sites to connect directly and immediately with a virtual provider who can write a prescription. So the point here is that there used to be a line between getting a prescription and getting a prescription filled, and seeing a doctor, getting a prescription and getting a prescription filled. That line is breaking down, and you have what are known as telehealth companies that can respond and give you a prescription, in the length of time I'm talking to you this afternoon. Some people think that's a risky thing to be having, but here's a picture, a little better than my light bulb picture, I think, but this is a picture of a fellow doctor named Oscar talk with our doctors for free. Welcome to Doctor on Call. He can help you with minor ailments such as colds and flu symptoms, free and unlimited. But if you press a button, you can talk to the doctor. And if you press another button, you can, in a sense, have the doctor answer a few questions and provide you with a prescription. And sorry about that. And next to last, Moderna and Pfizer. Nothing for me to tell you about there other than, of course, they're the two main vaccine companies. And you may or may not know, in the old days, I would have asked you to raise your hand. How many of you know that they're suing each other? Or Moderna is really suing Pfizer on intellectual property grounds. So these companies have made a fortune. It's what some of us would call chutzpah for one to be suing the other. But this is monetary value, but incredibly high monetary value. You can only imagine. And lastly, or next to last, and my screen is partly blocked by the, lastly, but perhaps most importantly, medical AI. So let me give you an example, I think, of medical AI. And this will lead us into what I think is the most widespread issue of health care problems, and that is electronic health records. But the electronic health records software market is a huge one, since every one of us, at least in this country, has an electronic health record, and some of us, myself included, if you have doctors in separate systems, will have more than one electronic health record. And the largest, most profitable company in that realm is called Epic. And it had an algorithm so that people admitted to hospitals with infections, it could predict whether they would have sepsis, which is a life-threatening disease. And about 9%, I think, of sepsis cases in the hospital actually do die. So this is as serious an issue as any I've mentioned today. And it turns out that Epic's algorithm for diagnosing whether or not this would work missed 2/3 of sepsis cases, rarely found cases medical staff did not notice, and frequently issued a false alarm. So after a few months, Epic took it back and has been rewriting it. So I thought that array of issues might be interesting to you. I should note that almost all of them were in the news this week. I found most of them, the ones I wasn't aware of, found them in the daily newspaper or a current issue of a magazine or something recently identified by Google. So there are lots of these. I could have gone on and made you watch 10 or so more of these, but I thought we'd talk a little bit about electronic health records. And again, if I were to ask you to raise your hand if this looks familiar to you, I think still most people in the United States would recognize these as medical records, paper medical records. Although slowly, very slowly, they're disappearing. But if you want as clear an example of analog to digital transformation, I think this is it. this being analog, this being digital. And the reason I'm not going to show you any more screens from your electronic health record is that this opens up into a huge number of issues, whereas this opens up to some paper. This opens up to a record that in the United States, at least currently, as of 2 months ago, you have just about absolute right to look at your record, to look at what your doctor has written down after you visit your doctor, to check your lab test results, to send messages to your doctor, to get prescriptions and have them refilled, and to schedule and manage appointments. This tells the doctor something and just about nothing else, although in fairness, I should mention to you that for 25 years almost, individuals have had a right to obtain the information that's inside these paper records. But if you think about the switch from analog to digital, the switch from analog to digital makes looking at digital easy, makes going to the doctor to get a copy of your file buried in the back room somewhere, intimidating to say the least. So the end result is no one ever looked at their paper file. And increasing numbers of people are looking at their electronic file. Well, that sounds all to the good. And hopefully it would have been all to the good, except for one simple fact, and that is that if you were to go to look at your electronic health record, again, it would be easy to do. And if you haven't done it, you definitely should do it. But among other things it includes is what they call a problem list. And this problem list, unfortunately, among every 5 or 10 people is likely to have a serious error. So what kind of serious error? Well, it may tell you have diabetes when you didn't have diabetes. It may tell you that you were once admitted to the hospital for an anxiety attack, which you didn't have. It may tell you that your chances of having breast cancer are significant, and on and on. I'm not making up any of these. These are all either confirmed by people I'm related to or people I've mentioned this to before. And this is highly unfortunate because this is what happens. There's no way you can read this, and actually there's almost no way I can read it, but it's labeled at the top, eHealth information flow. It's not meant to be precise and exact of how information or data flows, but it is meant to give you the idea that information is not located in the manila file. It's located somewhere, and this somewhere has some restrictions on it, but in spite of restrictions, these things, the data is flowing all over the place. And if you're worried about your privacy, well, you have some reason to worry about privacy. In this era, you had less worry about privacy. I don't know if you had less to worry about mistakes, but I do know that it was easier to correct a mistake in this environment than in this environment. Because in this environment, all you had to do was persuade the doctor to make a note somewhere on your record. In this environment, you're dependent upon the software engineer to plan ahead to design a system that allows complaints. And I think what you see here is no link, no button for dispute resolution, which of course it should have. If you go to look at one of the credit agencies, Experian, or I forget the other two, scroll down to the bottom, you get dispute resolution. You buy something on eBay, you can find a dispute resolution button. Go find your electronic health record. Well, then it becomes more cumbersome than the paper record, because you've got to persuade your doctor to do something your doctor really is hardly trained to do, and that is make a correction on your electronic health record. And when I say hardly in place to do, I should have said impossible to do, because doctors are not allowed to delete anything from a medical record for fairly good reason. If you want to sue your doctor or somebody later, you want a complete, accurate record. But it should be possible to put corrections in, and I haven't seen systems that allow that. So if you want to put a correction in your system, again, it's not impossible. You go to send a message to your doctor that something's a mistake, and ask the doctor to do something about it. And that's basically what it boils down to. Again, to summarize, why is this so important? Well, this is not my quote. This is official with the federal government. Information is the lifeblood of modern medicine. Health information technology is destined to be its circulatory system. I think that's perfectly true. The problem is that some of what's circulating is not very good information. And as I put here, it's flowing in all kinds of ways. And if you look here, Epic has the largest market share of the electronic health record. So I'd urge you two things. One is take a look at your electronic health record. If it seems perfectly accurate to you, that's all to the good. But if it doesn't, I'd complain to my doctor. The other thing I'd do, if you happen to go to your doctor and you're put in the waiting room and the screen is dark, or not dark, but it won't be dark because of the simple reason that the Epic and other companies want their logo on it. So on screensavers, instead of complete darkness, you'll have the Epic logo and the Epic name in all likelihood, but not necessarily the Epic name. So I think that's it. And I'm sure we have 15 minutes worth of possible comments or disagreements, or ideally questions. So Noam or because someone's managing the chat room, or is it empty?
No questions yet in chat. Would anyone like to make a comment, ask a question, weigh in?
I don't know what that was, Noam.
That was some noise. Someone had their mic unmuted and they were outside.
Background noise. I just have a quick
Ben?
question.
Yeah.
Pardon me. You, among others, have raised this issue of medical records and having the inability to make corrections. You've raised this before. What's the likelihood that someone's going to do something about it? What is the what's the best way to actually raise this as enough of an issue that someone actually takes action to correct it?
I think that's an easy question with a hard answer. Certainly complaining to your doctor is one thing. And if there were enough people who, we're willing to collect information from people and forward it to the software companies that are involved in this. I must say one of the first times I ever saw this was when I was going to a doctor in the Massachusetts General Hospital, and I was put in the waiting room, and on the screen was this saying, "There are no errors with electronic health records." And I said to him, "How do I change that?" Well, somehow it got changed. It's not there anymore. But it's something that if enough of you were interested in, I'd start making a bigger fuss about. As it turns out, I'd only make a fuss when I'm talking to a limited number of people. So, and I'd ask you to ask your doctor about whether it's possible to correct the problem list. I mentioned the problem list as being itself a problem because in my experience, the problem list only grows longer. So when you access your electronic health record and look at buried somewhere down in there is the problem list, it only gets longer. It almost never gets shorter unless you insist to the doctor as you're sitting there that you don't have this condition or you don't have it anymore. The other big problem is what's known as interoperability. I have doctors, some of whom belong to Beth Israel medical system in Boston, some of whom belong to the Mass General or partner system. They don't communicate with each other. The only way I can go from analog to digital is to take a CD walk it over from one place to the next. That's absolute absurdity.
Are doctors concerned about this, or do doctors?
I'm not going to generalize about it, but I went to the doctor a few weeks ago and said, I have a doctor of a similar specialty at Mass General, and you should send this over to him. It hasn't happened. I know it hasn't happened. There's no. I'd say there's certainly no financial incentive for him to do that, and it takes. And doctors are complaining about their time. Doctors are complaining about electronic health records in general, but that's. I guess if you're wondering, I consider electronic health records good and valuable, but in need of help. And Norman, my friend.
Yes, Ethan and I have blood that we've spilled together on this issue of electronic medical records. So if I could, Dan, can I get a clarification? Were you talking about government or industry action or professional action to try and get the accuracy of medical records improved?
Well, what I was talking about was sort of a continuation of a conversation we had before, and that is, if doctors cared about this, and if patients cared about it enough, the people who create the software would pay attention and perhaps correct it. But if doctors don't care about it, and nobody else is making noise about it, they have no incentive to change it.
Well, if I could, since you aren't talking about government action, which unfortunately has been the real driver of change in electronic medical records. I'm going to start with a wisecrack that Ethan and I heard years ago on the roots of electronic medical records or medical records in general from a very senior physician and computer information officer, CIO, Chief Information Officer, that electronic medical records are there so they can bill accurately and get what they deserve to get paid, and so they can protect themselves in case of suits. That means, I think, that in the second case, we have to find a critical to patient safety issue or two and start working to bring that forward and find solutions, evidence solutions for that problem. If I could add one more thing, I know this is a dispute resolution conference, but we found, Ethan and I together years ago, that we could make more headway by talking about not disputes and avoiding disputes, but establishing a patient-provider relationship that's productive and efficient and effective. So if you could keep that in mind.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that for a second? If I had known Norm was going to be here, which I thought he wasn't, I would have given him credit for half of what I know about electronic health records. But now that you're here, he does deserve half of what I know. The other thing, interesting point, Norm's last point about disputes. Of course, with electronic health records, we're talking about errors, which I put in the category of dispute, but doctors certainly don't put in the category of dispute. And vaguely recall Colin telling me about deadbeat buyers in the eBay as a label that wasn't going to be fruitful. So there's a linguistic issue here, but everything, I agree with all of what you said, Norm. Yeah, Colin.
Well, I want to echo something that Norm said. Ethan, you know that I'm doing a big project with the American Health Law Association. And we've been spending a year looking at disputes in the medical sector. And we actually didn't start out with electronic medical records. We started out with medical billing. So I've spent a lot of time, and there are three parties in any medical bill. You've got the patient, obviously, and you've got the provider, and then you've got the payer. So it's an incredibly inefficient system. And the thing that amazes me about working in the medical context is, as you say, the attitude about dispute resolution is very, well, we don't have any errors. We don't have problems. If there's a bill, somebody owes it. We don't need to build a process to go through and talk about the bill. That's just people trying to escape their responsibility. Now, I think one of the reasons why that's the case, and I've seen this attitude in other quasi-monopolies as well. It's like, well, we're the only hospital in this region, and if you're not happy with it, too bad, but you owe this money. And someone's saying, well, wait a minute, the bill is wrong. I never got this service. It says I was in a day. I wasn't there. It says the doctor gave me a treatment that I never even met. But I think that this is one of the issues. The thing that I find when I work with for-profit entities is they know that customer service and customer satisfaction is important. And at least they'll make, a gesture towards trying to provide fair redress to their consumers to say, oh, well, problems arise. It's inevitable. Let's build a system to work it out. I feel that attitude, I have not discovered that very much in the medical context. Now, I can't just with broad brush characterize everyone in the medical context because there's so many different players and it's such a massive industry. But I think that we need to inculcate within that industry this notion that problems are inevitable. These things arise. There's a lot of complexity in medical care. There can be a wrong code put in. There can be just human error. And maybe it's 1 to 3% of transactions or 1 to 3% of interactions between patients and providers and payers generate some sort of error. But as you say, I think the only action that we've seen has been regulatory action. That's one of the things that Norm mentioned. So now we have the No Surprises Act. And unfortunately, the No Surprises Act creates as many problems as it solves, because it's government coming in sort of with the iron fist and saying, okay, well, we've designed a redress process, and now everybody has to use our redress process. And our arbitrators are going to work at this rate per hour. And, there's no flexibility for the industry to design its own solution. But I think it's because the industry has dragged its feet in fixing the problem. Because I think there are some people who feel they get more money out of the system when they don't provide redress. So, I agree with Dan. I think if there is an issue that patients identify with electronic medical records, well, they'll make a stink about it, and then that's going to create a motivation for change. But if nobody's really complaining about it, and if hospitals sort of feel, well, nobody really cares, why should we invest money here when we have so many other burning issues that we need to address? So that's my sense of sort of the industry's attitude about this problem. And I think that we need to do some education to change that attitude.
And just as a side note, 1 to 3% of errors, when you think about the number of people who are treated in hospitals every day in the United States, 1 to 3% is a huge number.
Huge number. Huge number.
Yeah,
I would say, Colin, though, that it just occurred to me, but every hospital has an ombudsperson. Maybe start there.
Well, for certain kinds of disputes, so I've registered a domain name medicalodr.com, and I want to think about what do we put there. Now, this medical billing platform we built with HLA, that's more targeted, but I do think there's a question of which caseload do we start with. Knowing a lot of ombuds people and providing services to a lot of ombuds people, that is a place to start. But oftentimes, that's 1 or 2 or 3 people, and they don't even have any relationship with the billing people. They don't even have a relationship with the medical records people. They're often dealing with HR issues and malpractice complaints and things like that. So, but it is a place to start, because they are an entity within the healthcare system that appreciates the importance of redress. I'll shut up now. Norm, what did you want to say?
I think that's right. As an academic, though, what that tells me is that do a little survey, find 50 ombuds people in hospitals.
That's a
See
great
what
place.
kind of
That's a good
disputes
idea.
they get.
It's a great idea.
I would say, after giving you all that credit before, your screensaver makes it look like your head is buried in the sand.
Oh God, I'm just going to go surfing right afterward.
Yeah. No, I think your head's buried in the sand. Okay.
If I could, no one's picked up on one point I made about patient safety. There's old data, which may well be inaccurate, that medical errors are the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. And if it's not the 3rd, then it's the 4th, and people dispute it. God bless. But medical safety movements have made a big impact. And one of the ways we can have influence, if we could rally, is to get the safety certification folks, especially in the hospitals, to include accuracy of medical data in their evaluations of hospitals for certification.
Thank you, Norm. Anybody else? Okay. Well, we're really just on time. I would remind anybody who's interested in this that self-promotion here, but chapter 4 of Orna and my book, Digital Justice, which chapter deals with medical healthcare issues, is accessible by a link somewhere in the Cyberweek page, near the link you clicked on to get to where you are now. So thank you all for coming.